Sexto Congreso Internacional de Educación Médica, CIEM2021, Educación Médica en tiempos de pandemia. 28 y 29 de mayo de 2021, modalidad virtual. El evento más importante de la educación médica en el Perú. Con la participación de destacados conferencistas nacionales e internacionales. Vive la experiencia de este importante evento. Cursos precongreso. Conferencias en el auditorio principal. Reuniones institucionales. Exposición de libros. Trabajos científicos. Stand de exposiciones. Y mucho más. Además, se desarrollarán los siguientes ejes temáticos: cambios en la educación y la práctica médica, práctica clínica e internado, formación de médicos especialistas, competencias digitales, competencias en salud pública y atención primaria, bioética en la educación y la práctica clínica, investigación científica, tecnológica e innovación, evaluación formativa y sumativa en educación médica. Aspefam les da la bienvenida.
So a little bit of background. Many of you will be familiar with clinical research, and that may be your primary research activity. But just to define clinical research, we're looking at medical studies and trials carried out to test new treatments, new devices, interventions, other forms of therapy, to make decisions on prevention, diagnosis, and treatments of illness. And that's something that most of us are very familiar with. There's also biomedical research, which is, in terms of those that are working in medical education, again, this would be the second most common background for people. And this is science that looks for ways of preventing and treating diseases that cause illness and deaths, but more of the bench rather than the bedside. And then we have medical education research. So educational research is a systematic attempt to understand educational processes, generally with the view to improve them. And it's the application of scientific and social science methods to the study of educational problems. So while biomedical and clinical researchers seek ways to improve treatments that help patients, those researchers looking at medical education research seek ways to improve education so that doctors are better prepared to help patients. So we have the same goals, but we do it in different ways. Our focus is different. It's about extending knowledge and moving from opinion-based teaching to evidence-based teaching, just as over the years we've moved from opinion-based medicine to evidence-based medicine. The difference is that if you're a clinical researcher or a biomedical researcher, you tend to be working in your home discipline. You've been trained in those ways of thinking from early on, from starting your degree, from doing your postgraduate training for years and years and years. And you acquire certain ways of working and certain ways of thinking and certain assumptions. Because of that, we all do. That's just the way it is. There's actually relatively few people working in medical education who have actually been trained in education, who have education as their primary discipline. More often or not, people have shifted over from another discipline, medicine or anatomy or chemistry or biology. And that means we have to kind of shift our ways of thinking sometimes. So it's not just about clinical trials when it comes to education. We don't have the same outcome measures. There are different questions that we ask, so we have to shift our thinking, and I'll give you some examples of that as we go along. And my primary discipline is as a psychologist, and in fact my first paper ever, which was sadly a very long time ago, was looking at primates. So I didn't know anything about educational research until I moved into medical education just over 20 years ago. My background is very different, and my background is quite quantitative, whereas now I've had to embrace qualitative research, which was quite a challenge, although at least as a psychologist I had some knowledge of it. But these names, going back, these names will be familiar to you, William Osler and Flexner. And Osler had this saying that what might be called the natural method of teaching, the student begins with the patient, continues with the patient, and ends his study with the patient. Teach him, and note, it's always him. There were no women doctors, or very few women doctors at this point in time. Teach him how to observe, give him plenty of facts to observe, and the lessons will come out of the facts themselves. And unfortunately, we know that this way of training is no longer valid. We have to be a little bit more systematic. It's not just about putting students and residents in with patients and hoping for the best. And that is no longer allowed. We have to think about things like patient safety. And in fact, that brings me to this seminal report that was published just over 20 years ago. Oh gosh, actually, no, I'm wrong. Just over 30 years ago, identifying that nearly 100,000 deaths at that time were due to, in the US, were due to medical error. And further identifying that an important cause of medical error was how well someone is trained and supported in terms of ongoing education. So there's been increasing awareness really since this time that how somebody is trained, education is important, and thus we have to look to see what is effective, what works, understand what's happening. There's also other drivers underpinning educational change. You know, our patients are changing. Our patients tend to be older. They tend to have long-term conditions, comorbidities. We have a lot of lifestyle diseases now, diabetes, obesity. In many countries, there's a lot more governance and scrutiny of the medical profession. Doctors can't just do what they want. They have to adhere to certain norms and standards. And things are changing all the time in terms of technology and treatments, patient expectations, and how we work in hospitals and community settings. So there's a lot going on in our world, and we have to respond to those changes effectively. And that throws up lots of educational questions. You know, what works? What's best? What's the best type of education? What do we mean by best? Is that a psychometric outcome, or is it acceptability, or is it cost effectiveness? And who is it best for, learners or patients? We also want to know, why does something educational work? We want to know that at an individual level, a cognitive level, how people learn, the science of learning and so on. But we also want to know what's happening socially, because we are social creatures, we work in social environments. There's also things to be aware of, trends, political drivers, hidden curricula, so on. And finally, something that actually we're not very good at looking at, but there's increasing awareness of, what can we afford to do? You know, most people are working on limited budgets. Governments do not have limited funding for medical education. We have to look to see what's affordable and effective. So if you think of your own environment, think of working in medical education. You may supervise residents, you may be a resident program director, you may work at a medical school level, your interest might be assessment, it might be leading a particular course. There are so many different aspects to medical education that give us inspiration for research questions. Now, when I came into medical education, one of the first study I did was when 7 of our final year students failed their medical degree. I don't know if you remember this film, The Usual Suspects. And when their names were known, because initially everything was anonymized, when their names were known, the established staff were not surprised that these individuals had failed. However, as somebody who was quite new at that time, I found it very puzzling that they had got so far. They'd got through 5 years of medical school without failing. So we looked back to see how that had happened. How had these students progressed so far without being picked up? And we did a mixed method study. We spoke to the students, we did some qualitative data. We also looked at their results over the previous 5 years. And we found that the students had very little awareness of their level, their ability, their issues. Certainly not in line with their performance over the previous years. But we also found our systems weren't very good. We hadn't picked up on things. The students had just continued to go through year after year, just passing, maybe doing a research, really not being particularly good students, but we hadn't been able to, we hadn't done anything about it, we hadn't picked them up. So it wasn't just about them, it was also about that, about us, about our systems, our feedback, our assessments. So a lot of changes stem from this paper, but a lot of papers stem from this paper. So it threw up so many different questions, like any good research should. So we looked at who seeks feedback, and we found it was the better students, not the weaker students. We looked to see if this pattern of weak performance early on, predicting weak performance later on, if that held for everybody, and it did. We looked at why assessors didn't fail underperforming students. What were the barriers to actually saying to a student, you know, you're not doing very well, you know, you're not going to pass this rotation, this posting. And paper after paper followed, and we did lots and lots of research, but we also used that research to improve our systems and improve how we managed underperformance. So I think it's quite useful at this point in time to introduce you to a very kind of common framework that's used in medical education research, and many of you will be familiar with this. It's Kirkpatrick's levels of evaluation, about whether something works or not. So level 1 is participant reaction, level 2, the degree to which learning occurs, level 3, the transfer of learning into the workplace, and level 4, the impact of learning on patient outcomes. And these are quite common levels when we come to look at educational research. And I'm just going to give you some examples of these. And although this framework has its limitations, it's quite a neat way of thinking about things. So the level 1 is, it's very much participant reactions, student satisfaction surveys, whether students found something acceptable. It was good, I learned something, I enjoyed it. We all do these. They're limited. They're limited, and you read a lot of these studies, but they are only about level 1. It's about acceptability, and we need to do more than that. Level 2 is something measurable changed. This is an example that we did many years ago, where we did a pre and post study in simulation, teaching senior medical students how to cope with distractions in a simulated ward round, and we found that it made a change. What we did made a change in their behaviour. Then but you really want what you do educationally to make a change in the workplace. So these are some, I mean, again, sticking to surgical simulation, we know that there is this VR to OR, virtual reality to operating room transfer from simulation. So what residents and medical students and so on learn in simulation, they can then influences how their performance in the workplace. Lots and lots of evidence for this. And then the fourth one, which is the hardest, absolutely the hardest to measure, does education lead to better patient outcomes? And this is really tricky, because education is not a big randomized controlled trial. It's very difficult to separate out what is going on. But in some areas of education, it has been done. And again, sticking with simulation in surgery, there is evidence that simulation does actually have a positive impact on patient outcomes. But this is difficult to measure, and it's not something that many people do. But you also have to think, going beyond how did something work to how did something work. We have, as I've been alluding to, we have this big black box of education. What's actually going on in it? So just as an example, we had a surgical boot camp, and we wanted to know what was going on in the surgical boot camp. Actually, we started because we wanted to measure outcomes. We actually wanted to do a level 2 and a level 3 Kirkpatrick type study. But when we went in to do that, we realized there was actually far more interesting things happening. Yes, Yes, we wanted to know that it made a difference, that our teaching did learn to skills improvement and knowledge improvement, but we were also fascinated about all the more general things that were happening. How was that happening? So we did an ethnographic study, and this was a residential boot camp over 4 days, looking at technical and teaching technical and non-technical skills. I won't go into details because we've got limited time, but it was early stage residents, core surgical trainees. So we were teaching them how to suture, but we were also teaching them how to talk to consultants, how to take a phone call in the middle of the night, how to prioritize. So the more the kind of the non-technical side of surgical training. So we found that they gained skills, but we also found that they gained a whole lot more. They got a lot of insider information about surgical training. They developed networks of colleagues and more senior people. They developed more balanced views of the respective roles of technical and non-technical skills as a surgeon, because at that stage in their career, they came in very much prioritizing wanting to learn technical skills, but learned that actually there was more to it than that. They had a very safe environment to ask questions, and they got insight into professional identity, what's it like to be a surgeon. So this study went from completely turned upside down from our original ideas. And we concluded that simulation outcomes, of course, are about individual learning, and they can be measurable in terms of the impact on learners and ultimately patients. But there's more to simulation than this, because of learning being social and sociocultural. And the paper from that study won a prize at AMEE about 5 years ago, which we were very gratified to do, and particularly my surgical colleagues who now feel very comfortable with qualitative research, but hadn't when we started off in this pathway. So educational research, we have to think not just did it work, but how did it work? Why did it not work? Because some things don't work. And it worked there, but not here. We cannot assume that what works in one context will work in another. But we need research, we need educational research to inform our decisions, to underpin evidence-informed education. Speaking to your colleagues earlier this week when I was planning this presentation, they were telling me about some developments that were happening in your part of the world. So I thought it may be useful to just finish by talking about how we went from our first publication that I showed you in Medical Teacher in 2005 to having 200 publications now on educational research. And a lot of it was about building a community of practice, bringing together people who were interested in educational research and bringing together skills. So, you know, I had some skills as a psychologist, a colleague in another university would have some other skills. Nobody had everything, but we came together in a community of practice in Scotland called the Scottish Medical Education Research Consortium, and were able to collectively work together. One of the key things for this was getting some funding, the conditions of which were collaboration. And that really helped pull things together. Even though it wasn't much money, a little bit of money does focus the mind. And this is just Scotland, just for information, there's 5 medical schools and 1 postgraduate training provider. And the postgraduate training provider was the one that put up the money. But that started in 2010 and became very productive after about 5 years, partly because we aligned our ideas strategically with what was going on in Scotland. So this is an idea of the research focus, policy and practice priorities, notably workforce planning, support and development. We aligned with government priorities, and that gave us a lot more power and access to more money, as opposed to just following things that interested us. But as with any research, you can get a lot of ideas under some broad headings. So the research was actually very diverse. So with that, I'd like to finish now because time is limited. I'm finishing with some pictures of Scotland, which may interest you, somewhat different from your own context, and delighted to take some questions if we have time.
Gracias, doctora. Gracias, doctora, por su ponencia. A continuación, se dará paso a unas preguntas por un espacio de 10 minutos. Doctora Beatriz, por favor, si nos puede ayudar a las preguntas que hagan los participantes.
Muy bien, doctor. Muchas gracias, doctor Luis Alberto Concepción Urteaga. Pasaremos a las preguntas, ¿no? Por el momento tengo varias preguntas. Una de ellas es en relación de qué manera se podría promover y mejorar la investigación en la educación médica. Professor Jennifer Cleland, could you tell us how would be possible to promote and improve?
I think it's important to draw on the networks that are out there already. So you'll have heard of organizations such as AMEE and of course your own organization. So those, certainly AMEE produce many useful resources that people can use, the AMEE guides, the BME reviews. Keeping up to date with the literature and knowing what's happening is a really good place to start so that you can see where the gap in knowledge is, where the niche for doing some research is. I think the thing I see most commonly that's maybe an error is that in some countries where they're just starting off their journey in educational research, they don't look, it's important to look to see what's happening globally because that helps you focus your own efforts. And the journals are good ways to see what's important, what's topical, what are people talking about, what's of interest to the community. And that will help in terms of using resources, and by resources I include time, most effectively.
Thank you. Professor nos menciona, Professor David Sandu, quiere hacer un comentario. Lo escuchamos. Please, Professor.
Could I ask a question? Professor Cleland, thank you for a great presentation. I was particularly struck by your remark that on the failing students, that it came as a surprise to the students, but not to the teachers. So I was thinking about what has changed in medical education since then. I mean, people talk about a lot more formative assessment, mentoring. So could you think of some other sort of initiatives that have been taken to try and pick up the struggling students in our medical schools?
You've mentioned mentoring, you mentioned formative assessments. I think there's also a lot more emphasis on feedback now, of giving students feedback. I think there's also more evidence, more emphasis on faculty training and faculty development, an awareness that we're not all born good educators, if only, that actually educators need training too and need awareness of how best to work with a weaker student, how best to give feedback, how best to assess. So feedback, faculty development, assessment. I think there's also, I think there's been a shift in thinking that maybe 30, 40 years ago, we tended to always assume the issue was the student. And while it may well be, we also, I think we're better at reflecting now on what we do as educators and thinking, well, actually, we're not very good at formative assessment, or we don't have enough, or we could do something better, our systems aren't ideal. I think there's more awareness of the system side, our responsibilities as well.
Thank you.
Me gustaría primeramente traducir la primera parte de la pregunta en relación a cómo era posible promover y mejorar la educación, la investigación en educación médica. En lo referente a ello, profesor Jennifer Cleland mencionó que era importante primeramente enfocarnos en qué tenemos, ver nuestras limitaciones y fortalezas y en base a ello tratar de poder mejorar lo más que se pueda, ¿no? Siempre es bueno enfocarse en qué recursos tenemos y cómo podemos potenciarlos para mejorar y usarlos lo mejor eficientemente posible. En relación a la segunda pregunta que mencionó el profesor David Sandu, en relación a los aspectos formativos de la investigación en la educación médica, y qué se puede hacer con aquellos estudiantes que tienen muchas dificultades, ¿no?, en esos aspectos. Lo que mencionó profesor Jennifer Cleland fue que es muy importante tener en cuenta la información que proporcionan los estudiantes, ¿no? O sea, escuchar a los estudiantes y en base a ello ver qué medidas se pueden tomar. Y además también es muy importante educar a los educadores, ¿no? Nosotros como educadores tenemos mucha responsabilidad y es importante escuchar mucho a los estudiantes. Obviamente se analiza, se evalúa y se ve qué es mejor, ¿no? Hay también, I will continue, Professor Jennifer Cleland, with one more question, please. Could you tell us what are the new trends and challenges in medical education research? Because you mentioned before something about globalization trends. So what exactly means for us in the current condition, no? In the current condition we have now?
Okay. Well, I mean, there's lots of topics of interest, but I think one that strikes me is there's more awareness that contexts differ. That one cannot just take an innovation that was developed in one context, let's say the USA, and lift and shift it to another context, let's say Peru or Singapore. Yes. Because the contexts are completely different, the politics are different, the culture is different, the systems are different. What works in one place may not work in another. Yes. And so it's really important to test things out, but also to consider, is this appropriate for our context? Don't just take things blindly, assuming that they'll work somewhere else. We need to actually think it through and also then investigate it in the different contexts, and it may look different. So PBL, problem-based learning, for example, it looks different all over the world. You know, let's not pretend it doesn't, it does. Mm-hmm. And those differences are of interest. They're not wrong, they're actually interesting.
Mm-hmm. La pregunta que hice a profesor Jennifer Cleland fue en relación a cuáles son las nuevas tendencias y los nuevos desafíos que se tienen en relación con la investigación en la educación médica y en relación, teniendo en cuenta principalmente la condición actual que estamos viviendo. La respuesta de profesor Jennifer Cleland es que un aspecto muy importante que debemos considerar es el contexto en el cual vivimos, ¿no? El contexto cultural, político, social y económico, puesto que cada país es diferente. No podríamos comparar la educación, por así decirlo, en Estados Unidos, Japón, Australia, Inglaterra, y la educación en Perú, no porque sea mejor o peor, sino porque son diferentes los contextos que dominan en ese momento, ¿no? Entonces, lo primero es que ver en qué contexto nos encontramos, puesto que lo que funciona en un lugar no significa que va a funcionar en otro de manera igual, ¿no? Entonces, eso es un aspecto muy importante que se debe considerar. Hay otra pregunta también, profesora. I would like to ask you about, you mentioned levels in medical education, like 5 levels. Can you tell us if there are any indicator for each level that we will be able to know, no? How it's possible to know whether we are going good or going bad, no? Can you mention that, because I think indicators could let us know how we are going, no, about medical education.
Okay. I think, firstly, the first thing to do is to use what evidence is out there to underpin practice. I mean, while bearing in mind that context is important, it is useful to know that generally speaking, for example, an OSCE is a good way of assessing skills. So use that tool, but develop it for your own context. In terms of knowing if you're doing well, I think you can ask your students, you can ask your staff, you can measure outcomes. So if you change an aspect of teaching, do the student outcomes on assessments improve on that topic? Are students happier because you've changed something? Are staff happier? Is something working better, more smoothly? Do students seem better prepared? If you do a curriculum reform, for example, can you assess in some way that your graduates are better prepared to move into practice? I mean, none of these things are straightforward, but those are the kind of questions that most people ask themselves. How much time do we use, do we have to look at our curriculum to change things, to make things more contemporary? There are endless things, but measuring student responses, staff responses, and outcomes are really, it's the way forward. I would also encourage reflection, and I think that's quite difficult as educators. Often we think that what we do is, we always think that what we do is right. And sometimes it's quite hard to sit and think, well, actually, perhaps we could have done it better. It takes quite a lot of courage to reflect on something that you might be quite proud of, but actually, maybe it could have been done differently. So a bit of reflection as educators, ongoing reflection is useful.
Pregunté a la profesora Jennifer Cleland en relación a si hay indicadores para medir, ¿no?, cómo está la investigación en la educación médica, ¿no? Y en ese sentido, lo que responde, ¿no?, la profesora Jennifer Cleland es que en realidad no hay nada absoluto, pero algo muy importante que nosotros debemos considerar es la respuesta de los estudiantes, ¿no? Tenemos que considerar la respuesta de los docentes en base a cómo están enseñando, la respuesta de los estudiantes en base a cómo ellos están entendiendo esa enseñanza o ese proceso de enseñanza, y además ir revisando la currícula. No hay realmente nada absoluto y simplemente se requiere una revisión y evaluación de manera simultánea en base a la respuesta, ¿no?, de los estudiantes, de cómo va este proceso y en base a cómo los docentes consideran que este proceso está yendo, ¿no? Es en realidad una reflexión continua y un proceso de cambio continuo. There is also another question that I will let you know, Professor Jennifer Cleland, is how can we give the teachers the view of conformate the subject with investigation?
Oh, sorry, could you repeat that?
Yes.
Sorry.
How can we make the teachers teach research in medical education?
Oh, okay.
O sea, doing and saying is different. So, how can we do that?
So this is not about teaching students. This is about staff development.
Yes.
Okay. Right. I think it goes back to something I said earlier. There are resources available for people to access. There are things like journals, AMEE guides, BME reviews. There's a lot of information available. There's courses that can be taken. But we can't afford to send all our staff and all the professional development courses that are available. So certainly in my own experience is that if you can have even one or two staff in each medical school who champion educational research, who encourage other people, who mentor other people, support research, then they're the ones that can do the external training and then cascade it internally. But the mentorship is very important. There's no point in training people in research, but then not giving them the support. So I would say try to find local champions to develop, and then they in turn will develop others.
Yeah. De acuerdo con el profesor Jennifer, en relación a cómo podemos enseñar a hacer investigación a los docentes, cómo se puede transmitir eso, básicamente lo importante es desarrollar esto como un proceso, ¿no?, que es algo importante para ello. En relación a otras preguntas del público, me parece que ya no hay más preguntas en el público, estamos ya también con el tiempo. Thank you very much, Professor Jennifer Cleland, for your answers. I think we've finished with all the questions from now. Pasaré con el doctor Luis Alberto Concepción Urteaga para que nos dé las palabras finales y le doy el pase, doctor Luis Alberto Concepción Urteaga.
Gracias. Gracias, doctora Beatriz Ayala, por su excelente participación en esta conferencia. Agradecemos a la profesora Jennifer Cleland por su ilustrativa conferencia y damos por terminada esta sesión e invitamos a todos los participantes de este congreso a que continúen con todas las actividades. Muchas gracias.